I turned 48 this past January, a milestone I used to celebrate with enthusiasm. For 22 years, my wife had organized lively parties, ensuring these occasions felt special. But things have changed. Our marriage began to unravel nearly a year ago, starting when she joined a co-ed baseball team. It seemed like a harmless hobby at first, something to fill the time and keep her active. Yet, it triggered a series of events that gradually eroded the foundation of our relationship. At 42, my wife is still youthful and vibrant in many ways, but I initially chalked up her new interest to a midlife crisis. The pandemic lockdown had been rough on her. She worked from home, and despite her efforts with home workouts and strict dieting, the results weren't what she hoped for. It affected her self-esteem. With the kids now grown and out of the house, it was just the two of us most days. I never complained. Instead, I encouraged her, reminding her that aging was natural and beauty was more than physical. She has always been the type to take pride in her appearance. Her work in marketing makes her keenly aware of how much first impressions matter. When the pandemic restrictions eased, she felt a strong urge to join some group activity. After discussing several options, we settled on a baseball team she found through an app called Meetup. The group met 3 times a week and was convenient for her schedule, though primarily made up of men. I wanted to join her, but my work as a plumber often has me tied up with long, unpredictable hours. She has always called me a workaholic, and perhaps I am. There's a sense of accomplishment in fixing things that keeps me motivated, and honestly, it was easier than running my own business, which I gave up years ago to escape the relentless demands of managing it all. Her first game was memorable. She came home utterly exhausted, her muscles aching from head to toe. I gave her a thorough massage, from her feet to her thighs, as she recounted how much fun she'd had. Over the next few weeks, her enthusiasm grew, but so did her complaints about one teammate in particular, Craig. Craig was a larger-than-life personality, the kind of guy you either love or hate. According to her, he was controlling, flirtatious with all the women, and always had something to say about his ex-wife, whom no one in the group had ever met. He had a string of failed marriages, a reputation as a muscle car fanatic, and a past filled with substance misuse. Still, people seemed to gravitate toward him. He was funny, outgoing, and quick to offer favors, whether fixing cars or sharing free samples of marijuana, which he apparently dealt on the side. Her opinions about him were a mix of disdain and fascination. She would complain about his bad habits, his bragging, and the influence he seemed to wield over the group. Yet, her stories about him became a regular feature of our conversations. One night, she came home smelling faintly of marijuana. I asked her about it, and she brushed it off, saying her teammates were smoking, and she must have picked up the smell. But it wasn't a one-time thing. Every game night, the scent lingered when she returned home. Then, one evening after she showered, I joined her, and during a moment of closeness, I could taste it on her lips. I asked her directly if she'd been smoking, and she admitted she tried it once because she didn't want to seem awkward by refusing when it was passed around. I lost my temper. It wasn't just the smoking. It was the hypocrisy. We had always taught our kids to stand firm against peer pressure, yet here she was doing the opposite. With our children now young adults, 23, 21, and 18, I asked how she'd feel if they made similar choices. She told me to calm down, but it was hard to let it go. She brushed off her marijuana use as a one-time thing, insisting she hadn't even inhaled it properly. I chose not to argue or lecture her about it, even though she had always been the type to preach to others about staying away from drugs, especially our kids. Between the two of us, I've always been the quieter one, not one to provoke confrontation or take on the disciplinarian role in the family. Yet, seeing her act so contrary to her usual self was disconcerting. Something had shifted within her, and it wasn't just the smoking. It was the contradiction of her values. The act itself didn't bother me as much as the hypocrisy. Who had influenced her to try it? I couldn't shake the unease of seeing someone who had always been so principled act so indifferent. For weeks, she had gone on about how terrible this guy Craig was, and now she had sampled the very thing he offered. It made no sense. After that, I began noticing subtle changes. She continued using marijuana, despite her efforts to cover it up with showers, freshly laundered sportswear, and meticulous dental hygiene. Still, the faint smell lingered. I didn't bring it up again, partly because I knew she'd either deny it or spin some weak justification, and partly because I realized it gave me leverage against her self-righteous behavior. Thanksgiving rolled around, and my 3 kids came to visit. It was a time my wife usually loved, a chance to host and prepare an extravagant feast. But this year, something was off. She was absent the entire day, which was completely unlike her. When she finally came home, I asked where she'd been. She said she had visited some friends but later changed her story, claiming she'd had car trouble and had taken the car to Craig for repairs. Her explanation didn't sit right with me. It was Thanksgiving, and her priority should have been spending the day with her family. I pointed this out, reminding her that most people spend the holiday with loved ones. Her response was evasive. She said she had informed our daughter she'd be late and expected her to take care of the meal. Even the kids noticed something was off. They thought we were fighting because her behavior had become so uncharacteristic. On Thanksgiving Day, my wife retreated to bed, claiming she was sick. For the first time in years, I had to scramble to take my kids out to a restaurant for dinner. Before we left, I insisted she come along. She wanted me to make excuses for her absence, but I refused, telling her it was her responsibility to explain herself to the kids. Reluctantly, she joined us, but it was obvious something wasn't right. At the restaurant, she cracked awkward jokes and seemed distant, almost like she was there against her will. After dinner, my daughter pulled me aside, half-jokingly asking what I'd done to her mom because she was acting so strangely. She also commented on how much weight her mom had lost, wondering if her odd behavior was connected to her extreme dieting. I decided to be honest. I told her that her mom had joined a baseball team, made some questionable new friends, and started experimenting with marijuana. My daughter laughed it off, thinking it was a joke. She couldn't believe her mom, who had always been so strict about such things, would ever act this way. When the kids left after Thanksgiving, I confronted my wife. I told her she needed to rein things in. Her behavior was veering into college girl territory, and it wasn't acceptable for someone in her position. Even then, the idea that she might be having an affair hadn't crossed my mind. My trust in her was so strong that infidelity seemed impossible. But things took a darker turn when I received a notification that our shared bank account, used for household expenses like groceries and utilities, was overdrawn. A withdrawal of $1,200 had been made, and I hadn't been notified beforehand. I called her multiple times, but she didn't answer. Concerned, I canceled my remaining work appointments for the day and headed home. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was an old, classic car, a 1964 Pontiac GTO, parked on the street near our house. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't seen the car before, but as a classic car enthusiast, it immediately caught my attention. The 1964 Pontiac GTO parked near my house was a sight to behold. Its presence piqued my curiosity, though it also raised questions. I parked my car in the driveway, right behind my wife's, and headed toward the front door. As I approached the house, I heard the backyard door slam shut. It startled me. I assumed it might have been my wife, considering her car was in the driveway, and with her job allowing remote work since the easing of pandemic restrictions, she should have been home. But something about the hurried way the door had closed didn't sit right with me. Intent on asking her about the $1,200 withdrawal from our account and why she hadn't answered my calls, I rushed to the backyard. Just as I opened the door leading outside, I heard the creak of the backyard fence gate. Whoever had gone through it had to have been moving fast to reach it so quickly. That realization set off alarm bells. I began to suspect it wasn't my wife, but someone else entirely, perhaps even a burglar. The layout of our house makes the backyard fence gate invisible from the entrance. You'd have to step into the backyard to see anyone near it. By the time I reached the gate and opened it, whoever it was had disappeared. The stillness of the neighborhood felt unnerving. broken only by the unmistakable smell of marijuana lingering in the air. Someone had definitely been smoking back there. Just then, I heard my wife calling me from inside the house. I quickly went back in and found her freshly showered, her hair still damp. Something about her demeanor seemed off. I asked her point-blank about the person who had been in the backyard smoking. She denied anyone had been there, claiming she had smoked earlier to avoid bothering me with the smell. Her response felt flimsy. I pressed further, pointing out how unusual her behavior had been for months and accusing her of crossing boundaries by allowing people into our home. My frustration boiled over, and I asked her outright if she was having an affair, perhaps with the person who had bolted from the backyard. She reacted with a mix of denial and indignation, as if I were speaking a foreign language. Switching gears, I asked about the $1,200 withdrawal from our shared account, the one meant for household bills. She claimed she had lent the money to a friend in need and assured me it would be repaid soon. Her explanation sounded so implausible it left me reeling. Her words didn't feel like those of the responsible, grounded woman I'd known for decades. They felt more like the excuses of someone caught up in addiction, or something equally consuming. Frustrated, I asked why her friend thought she was a bank and why she hadn't asked for my permission before making such a large withdrawal. Her irritation flared, and she dismissed my concerns. But I was firm. I told her there would be consequences if the money wasn't back in the account by tomorrow. That evening, I went through our bank statements, trying to piece together what had been going on. What I found shocked me. She hadn't been contributing her fair share to the account. Since much of her income comes from commissions, I knew her earnings could vary. But her contributions were far below what we'd agreed upon, barely a quarter of what they should have been. When I confronted her about it, she admitted she had only been working the minimum hours required to keep her job. Her excuse was exhaustion from working out and playing sports, claiming she needed the time to lose weight. She argued that with the kids no longer at home, we didn't need as much money as before. That was the last straw for me. I told her if she was cutting back on work hours, she had no right to lend money to her friends or indulge in her new lifestyle. I also insisted she quit the baseball team. It was tearing apart the foundation of our marriage. I gave her an ultimatum. It was either our marriage or her sports. She exploded. Her anger spilled over in insults, calling me controlling and insecure. I told her flat out that if she continued with the baseball team, our 22-year marriage might come to an end. She was furious, outraged that I would even entertain the idea of ending everything over something she deemed trivial. She dismissed me, suggesting I seek help because, in her words, I was acting overly emotional and immature. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told her she wasn't the woman I married, that everything had changed since she started playing on that team and hanging out with her new friends. Household chores were neglected. Meals went unprepared, and she barely worked. It felt like she was living like a carefree college dropout while I carried the weight of our responsibilities. She shot back, accusing me of being jealous of her improved appearance and newfound social life. Then, with a cold finality, she implied she'd consider ending the marriage herself before storming out of the room. That night, we argued bitterly, and I eventually took my pillow to the couch. By morning, things hadn't improved. She refused to speak to me, let alone cook or show any sign of reconciliation. It was clear she was waiting for me to apologize and give her the green light to continue with her behavior, but I wasn't budging. We didn't exchange a single word all day. The next day happened to be one of her baseball game days. Before I left for work, she made it a point to see if I was serious about my ultimatum. As I got ready, she strolled past me, boldly declaring she would do as she pleased and that I couldn't stop her from pursuing her happiness. I didn't respond. I simply got dressed, grabbed my things, and left the house. That afternoon, I contacted a divorce lawyer to draft a separation agreement. My intention wasn't to end things right away, but to give her a wake-up call. Whether this was a midlife crisis, the onset of menopause, or something else entirely, I believed this would make her realize how close she was to losing her family. The lawyer quickly prepared the papers, and I picked them up on my way home. When I arrived, My wife wasn't there. I wasn't sure where she had gone, but when she finally returned, she wasn't dressed for baseball. I was relieved, though still determined to show her I was serious. I hoped that presenting her with the divorce papers would make her rethink her choices. Despite everything, I still loved her and wanted to save our marriage. As she passed through the living room without a word, heading straight to the kitchen, I retrieved the papers. When I handed them to her, the shock on her face took me by surprise. Her eyes widened, her mouth hung open, and for a moment, she seemed frozen. Then, suddenly, she shoved me and threw the papers back in my face, yelling that she couldn't believe I was going through with it. Tears streaming down her face, she ran upstairs, crying out that she hadn't even gone to the game that day. I stayed behind in the kitchen, gathering the papers from the floor. Despite the commotion, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of satisfaction. My plan was working. I placed the papers back in their folder and hoped this was the shock she needed. Later that night, my daughter called. She wanted to know why I was divorcing her mom over a baseball game. It turned out my wife had vented to her, making me out to be the unreasonable one. I explained to my daughter that she had seen her mother's behavior during Thanksgiving and knew how different she had been. I didn't mention my suspicions about an affair, but my daughter assured me that she didn't think her mom was cheating. She urged me to try and work things out. We talked for over an hour, and her words gave me a lot to think about. The next morning, before I left for work, my wife surprised me. For the first time in months, she made me breakfast and packed a lunch. She apologized for everything she had put me through and promised to change. She said she'd spent the night reflecting and admitted she had been wrong. I told her I would give her 1 month to turn things around. If she kept smoking, hanging out with her friends, or neglecting her responsibilities, I would have no choice but to proceed with the divorce. I also reminded her the $1,200 needed to be repaid. She agreed, and we made amends, at least for the moment. The next day, I came home to another unexpected development. After our previous argument, my wife opened up to me in a way she hadn't before. She admitted that she'd been under tremendous stress, both from the impact COVID had on her job and from my demanding work schedule. She said she felt overwhelmed and had been searching for an escape. Initially, baseball offered some relief, but over time, she turned to marijuana, claiming it helped her relax and manage her anxiety. For the first time, she confessed she had been struggling with depression and was on medication for it. Surprisingly, she revealed that since she started using marijuana, her reliance on her medication had decreased. When I asked her about the person who had fled from our backyard, she insisted there hadn't been anyone there. Yet, I could tell she wasn't being entirely truthful. Regarding the $1,200 withdrawal, she apologized and asked me not to be upset. She admitted it was used to buy marijuana and explained that it might take her a while to replace the money. While her admission frustrated me, I didn't want to disrupt the progress we seemed to be making. She looked genuinely remorseful, and for a moment, I felt hopeful that we were turning a corner, that I might finally get my wife back. For a couple of days, things seemed to return to normal. It felt as if we'd settled into a semblance of our old routine. I accepted that her marijuana use might not stop entirely since she claimed it helped with her anxiety and depression. My bigger concern wasn't the smoking itself, but the people she was dealing with to obtain it. Living in a state where marijuana wasn't legal only heightened my worry, as it meant she was associating with potentially questionable individuals. Despite my concerns, I chose not to confront her further, preferring to avoid conflict. This decision seemed to embolden her, as she started to believe she was adept at hiding it. She did start working extra hours again, contributing a bit more to our shared account. However, it was still far from what she used to contribute. I continued to shoulder the bulk of our expenses, covering 70 to 80% of the bills, including the mortgage. One evening, as we were watching TV, her phone rang. She answered it and walked into another room, her voice carrying faint giggles through the walls. When she returned to the couch, I casually asked who had called. Her defensiveness was immediate and unusual. She claimed it was just a friend. Her reaction set off alarm bells in my mind. On another occasion, I came home early and went to grab a beer from the refrigerator, only to find it missing. Since I was the only one in the house who drank beer, it didn't make sense. Our kids had moved out, and my wife didn't touch the stuff. This left me wondering whether she had cleared the fridge for some reason, or if someone else had taken it. The thought nagged at me, raising suspicions that she might be inviting someone over while I wasn't home. Christmas came and went. My wife behaved better than she had during Thanksgiving, which my kids noticed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was putting on a performance. By January, she had reverted to her old habits, smoking excessively, sleeping through the day, and working less. On my birthday, she didn't plan a celebration, buy me a gift, or even suggest going out for dinner. When my kids called to wish me a happy birthday, it stung to realize she had forgotten entirely. I reminded her of my birthday, and she seemed genuinely surprised she had forgotten. She apologized, blaming it on her marijuana use, and claiming it was affecting her memory. She explained that she'd marked it on her calendar, but simply overlooked it. I didn't argue further, but the incident added to my growing concerns. Around this time, I discovered the Ring doorbell system at a client's house. The idea of being able to see who was at your front door in real time intrigued me. I considered how it might help me understand what my wife was doing during the day and who she was inviting into our home. I purchased one and installed it at our house. My wife paid little attention to it, brushing it off as just another one of my useless gadgets. The Ring system connected to my phone, notifying me of any motion at the door and recording videos I could access later. On the first day after installation, I received a notification while at work, but was too busy to check it right away. When I finally reviewed the footage, I saw a man standing at our front door. He didn't knock. My wife opened the door almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for him. She welcomed him inside like she'd known him for years. Watching the footage, my mind raced with possibilities. Could this be the same man who had fled through my backyard before? The one helping himself to my beer? Or was this Craig, the marijuana supplier, and possibly the man she might be involved with? I couldn't shake the thought that something was deeply wrong. The man was still in the house. I checked the live feed on my phone as I sped home, but the connection kept freezing, making it impossible to see what was happening in real time. My heart pounded with anxiety and anger, but I forced myself to focus on the road. I had to get there before he left. When I finally pulled into the driveway, only my wife's car was there. I rushed inside, heading straight to the master bedroom. The bed was unmade, and the room felt heavy and stale. The stagnant air could have been from my wife's recent shower, or something else entirely. My wife wasn't there, nor was the man. I searched the closet, under the bed, anywhere someone might hide. Then I heard the backyard door creak open. My pulse quickened as I hurried downstairs, thinking the man might be making another escape. As I reached the middle of the staircase, my wife emerged from her home office, located near the kitchen. Her expression stopped me in my tracks. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. She was wearing only a white robe and seemed startled, asking why I was home early and what had me so worked up. I took a moment to collect myself, knowing I couldn't let on that I suspected her of something so serious. It started to sink in. I'd missed him again. Confronting her then would have been pointless. She'd just deny everything, even if I showed her the footage. Instead, I decided to bide my time. Her reaction told me she suspected something was off, but she couldn't figure out what. Thinking on my feet, I gave her a random excuse about needing a tool, a Makita cordless metal hole punch. I doubted she even knew what it was, but I wanted to maintain an air of normalcy while gauging her reaction. I headed to the basement, grabbed a random tool, and came back upstairs. She hadn't moved from where she stood, still looking shocked and frozen. As I approached her, I kissed her cheek as I always did when leaving, though the smell of marijuana clung faintly to her. She had clearly been smoking not long before. I pretended everything was normal, asking her why she seemed so uneasy and if she was okay. She nodded, her voice faint, and walked me to the door. As I left, I couldn't stop wondering how this man managed to be in my home and slip away without being caught. This had to be the second time I just missed him, and it gnawed at me. Even as I walked to my car, I kept glancing back, half expecting him to appear. My wife lingered at the door, watching me. I tried to stay composed, but my thoughts were racing. Once in my work van, I pretended to go through paperwork while discreetly checking the ring footage on my phone. Sure enough, he had left before I arrived home. I had missed him by mere minutes. As I sat there, staring at my phone, my friend, who was also my employer, called, asking why I had left the client's job unfinished. Apparently, the client had called to complain. I was working on a bathroom renovation and considered calling it a day, but I knew it would be a hassle for another plumber to pick up where I'd left off. Reluctantly, I decided to return to the site and finish the job. The rest of the day was a blur. My hands worked on autopilot, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the events at home. I couldn't shake the disbelief that my wife might be throwing away 22 years of marriage for a man who sold marijuana and some fleeting recreational escape. The thought of how much she'd changed, how far she'd strayed from the principled, traditional woman I'd known, was almost too much to bear. After finishing work, I couldn't bring myself to go home. Sitting in my van, I struggled to decide what to do next. The thought of going home felt unbearable, so I drove to a local bar. I'm not much of a drinker, but I figured being around people might help clear my mind. I ordered a beer, sat at the bar, and let my thoughts wander. That's when the idea hit me. I could buy a video recorder and a GPS tracker to monitor my wife's movements. If she was going to keep secrets, I needed to uncover the truth. After leaving the bar, I stopped at a nearby electronics store. Unfortunately, they didn't have anything reliable, so I ordered a GPS device and a hidden camera online. While I was there, I picked up 2 voice-activated recorders, intending to place them in the bedroom in my wife's home office. When I finally returned home, I was greeted by the smell of my favorite meal, something my wife used to do often, especially when she felt guilty. She greeted me warmly, acting like everything was normal. I played along, pretending not to notice the effort she was making to smooth things over. After a quick shower, I joined her for dinner. I even joked about how unusual it was for her to cook lately. She laughed it off, insisting she always made dinner. It was light-hearted on the surface, but I couldn't shake my resentment. Despite the tension brewing inside me, I made an effort to keep my composure. After dinner, though, my emotions got the better of me. I felt the overwhelming urge to confront her but decided against it. Instead, I grabbed the dog's leash and went for a walk. The cool evening air helped clear my head. I thought about calling my daughter to share my suspicions, but decided it wasn't fair to involve her. If I was going to catch my wife red-handed, I needed to keep this to myself for now. While walking, I kept replaying the image of the man from the ring footage. He was tall, thin, with brown hair. His face was etched into my memory. I knew I could recognize him anywhere. I needed to understand the depth of this situation. How far had things gone? Was this just about marijuana, or was it something more? When I returned home, my wife was already asleep. The thought of sharing the same bed, knowing she might have been with this man there hours ago, made my stomach turn. Sleeping in the guest room would arouse suspicion, so I forced myself to endure the discomfort and lay beside her. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I got up and quietly installed the voice recorders, one in the bedroom and the other in her home office. The next morning, she was up before me, preparing breakfast as though nothing had happened. Her behavior seemed more normal, and it was easier for me to keep up the act compared to the day before. At work, I couldn't resist checking the Ring camera feed, even though I had set up motion notifications. The first 2 days were uneventful. She left the house only once to go grocery shopping and even called me to let me know. On the 3rd evening, after spotting the stranger at our door, I retrieved the voice recorder from her office and listened to it in my van. What I heard confirmed my worst fears. My wife had been spending hours on the phone with a man named Craig, a member of her baseball team. From their conversations, it became clear she wasn't attending games anymore but had grown close to him. Craig was persistent, asking when he could visit, but my wife seemed wary after I had unexpectedly come home one day, nearly catching them. Their discussion revealed that Craig had a girlfriend and 3 kids, so meeting at his place was out of the question. He suggested cheap alternatives, a parking lot, for instance, but she refused, saying that was crossing a line. Ironically, she had no qualms about being intimate in our bed. He then proposed his workplace, a mechanic shop he co-owned, where they had been together before. She hesitated, concerned that his business partner might catch them again. Apparently, during Thanksgiving, his partner had stumbled upon them, and it hadn't gone over well. Listening further, I pieced together that my wife was receiving marijuana from Craig, possibly as payment for their intimacy or at least at a discount. The conversation left little room for doubt. She had crossed boundaries I never imagined she would. Lying in bed that night, the weight of what I'd uncovered pressed heavily on me. The next steps weighed heavily on my mind. I feared my wife's growing suspicion might ruin my chances of catching her in the act, leaving me to confront her without the decisive evidence I wanted. The next morning, while taking a shower, an idea struck me. I needed to find her stash of marijuana. It was clear she was smoking daily, relying on peppermint and mouthwash to mask her breath. I suspected she was dependent on it, using it as a coping mechanism since she had stopped taking her prescribed medication. If I could locate and dispose of her stash, I might force her to reach out to her supplier again, potentially giving me the opportunity one needed to confirm my suspicions. The challenge was how to find it without tipping her off. She was home most of the time, leaving the house only briefly. A thorough search would take time, and I couldn't risk being caught. Then I remembered that our daughter was scheduled to visit for the weekend, as she and her mom often spent a day at her grandmother's house in the countryside. Their visit would give me the perfect window to search the house. In preparation, I returned the voice recorder to her office, ensuring everything appeared normal. The rest of the week passed uneventfully, though my wife remained somewhat distant, her suspicions evident in subtle ways. When my daughter arrived on Friday, she asked how her mom was doing. I assured her everything was fine, keeping my concerns to myself. My daughter has a good heart, but struggles to keep secrets. Sharing anything with her could jeopardize my plans. On Saturday morning, my wife and daughter left for their visit. As soon as they were gone, I retrieved the voice recorder from her office and listened to the recordings in my car. The content confirmed much of what I already suspected. The man involved was Craig, from her baseball team. His conversations revealed that he was more than just a marijuana supplier. He had a past riddled with struggles, including a fall from grace after a promising career in the minor leagues. An accident had left him addicted to painkillers, which led to his downfall. While Craig's life story painted a picture of someone battling his own demons, it baffled me that my wife was drawn to him. She had no known traumatic experiences that might explain her behavior. The depression she recently confessed to seem to stem from the prolonged isolation during the pandemic and her struggles with weight gain. Despite the recordings and her apparent guilt, she maintained her story of ignorance whenever I indirectly questioned her, as if trying to shield Craig from my suspicion. Before my wife left for the weekend, I installed cameras in the master bedroom and the living room, determined to gather irrefutable evidence. With the house to myself, I began searching for her stash. I combed through every room, closet, and drawer, considering hiring a sniffer dog at one point. By the end of the day, I had come up empty-handed. I started to wonder if she had taken the stash with her, or if she had nothing left. On Sunday, while sitting on the couch watching TV, inspiration struck again. I hadn't searched the backyard. I went outside just before sunset and began inspecting the area. It didn't take long before I found a Ziploc bag tucked away, containing marijuana and a grinder. I flushed the marijuana down the toilet, but returned the empty bag to its hiding spot to avoid raising suspicion. It was clear why she kept it outside, probably to avoid the telltale smell indoors. The backyard, after all, was where she often smoked and where her affair partner had once made his escape. I decided to move the camera from the living room to the backyard, hiding it discreetly. After a successful test run, I felt relieved. Now I could monitor the area without her knowledge. My next step was to install the GPS tracker in her car once she returned. On Sunday evening, she came back, acting as though everything was normal. After she went to bed, I quietly installed the GPS tracker in her car. On Monday morning, after my daughter left, I contacted the divorce lawyer who had previously prepared our separation agreement. I explained the full situation, including my wife's infidelity and the evidence I had gathered. Unfortunately, the lawyer informed me that our state operated under a no-fault divorce system. This meant that no matter how much evidence I collected, her infidelity wouldn't impact the division of assets or the proceedings. All we could claim were irreconcilable differences as the grounds for divorce. The lawyer assured me the finalized divorce paperwork would be ready the next day. In the meantime, I confided in my friend and employer about the situation, explaining that I might need to leave work abruptly if my phone alerted me to something suspicious. Since the Ring camera and GPS tracker were linked to my phone, I could monitor my wife's activities remotely while on the job. That day, I saw her on the camera searching the backyard for her stash. She looked frustrated when she couldn't find it, but eventually gave up and went back inside. I kept my phone within reach, ready to act if she invited him over again. Instead, she got into her car and drove off. Thanks to the GPS tracker, I was able to follow her movements. She went to an unfamiliar location, stayed for about 30 minutes, and then returned home. I marked the location for future investigation, disappointed that things hadn't unfolded as I had hoped. Still, the GPS provided valuable insight into her activities. When she came home, she went straight to the backyard, lit up some marijuana, and carefully hid the rest in the same spot. It confirmed my suspicion. She had met him to replenish her supply. Update: I should mention that once I discovered her infidelity, I immediately got tested for STDs. Thankfully, the results came back negative. Since spotting her affair partner on the Ring camera, I haven't been intimate with my wife. Historically, I was the one who initiated those moments, and she hasn't sought it out either. It's clear she's emotionally and physically involved with this other man. Her recent 30-minute visit to his location only reinforced my belief that their relationship is more than casual. After work, I traced the unfamiliar location she had visited. It turned out to be a mechanic shop. To my frustration, I spotted the 1964 Pontiac GTO, the same car I had seen on my street the day someone fled from my backyard. A wave of anger surged through me, knowing this man had been inside my house. The familiarity he seemed to have with my backyard suggested he had been there more than once. I parked a few blocks away and staked out the shop. As evening fell, I saw him come out with another man. They closed the garage doors and stood out front, smoking. From my distance, I couldn't tell if it was cigarettes or marijuana. Though I should have been heading home, I couldn't resist staying to watch, my thoughts spiraling. I found myself questioning why my wife had chosen him over me, why she had betrayed me for someone like him. There was something about his life that seemed to excite her, something I couldn't offer. When they finished smoking, he got into his car and drove off. Seeing an opportunity, I decided to follow him and find out where he lived. If he could come into my home and disrupt my life, it felt only fair that I know where he lived. Dark thoughts filled my mind. I even thought about confronting him directly. I had a concealed Springfield Hellcat handgun in my car, and for a fleeting moment, I considered using it. But logic prevailed. I knew that if something happened to him, suspicion would immediately fall on me. I followed him to a restaurant, where he picked up a woman. At first, I thought she was his girlfriend and snapped a few pictures of them. The lighting wasn't ideal, so the images were grainy, but I remained parked at a distance to avoid being seen. They drove to an apartment complex with street parking, and as I observed their interactions, it became clear she wasn't his girlfriend. Their behavior suggested a passionate relationship. They couldn't keep their hands off each other as they entered the building. My frustration grew. This man wasn't just a dealer. He was also a womanizer, and my wife was one of his conquests. I debated waiting for him to leave so I could continue following him and locate his residence, but with no way of knowing how long he'd stay, I decided to take a photo of his license plate instead and call it a night. Now, I knew more about him than ever before. He wasn't just a bad influence. He was a man who thrived on manipulating and seducing women, my wife included. The following days were some of the hardest I've endured. Sharing a home with her, knowing the truth, became almost unbearable. I was reaching my breaking point. The hope of salvaging our marriage was slipping away, and I began seriously contemplating divorce so we could finally part ways. The stress of the situation was unbearable, especially with the constant fear that she might discover the Ring doorbell's true purpose, find the voice-activated recorder, or stumble upon the hidden camera. The monotonous routine of watching her on the backyard camera, smoking twice a day, and conversing with her affair partner was wearing me down. I estimated it might take her 3 to 4 weeks to deplete her stash, but I couldn't bear the thought of living in the same house for that long, knowing she was involved with another man. Desperate to expedite things, I decided to intervene. Late one night, after she went to bed, I grabbed a flashlight and went to the backyard. I unearthed her bag of marijuana, which also contained a mixture of tobacco. I removed more than half of the contents before carefully returning the bag to its hiding spot. Then, I went back to bed. Update the next morning, while at work, I checked the camera feed and saw her smoking again. I wasn't sure if she noticed the stash was lighter, but she didn't show any obvious signs of suspicion. Skipping ahead a few days, I spent my time gathering documents and organizing my affairs. Besides our shared bank account, which held only a modest sum, and the house, which was already paid off, the only other assets requiring division were our retirement savings. She had roughly $45,000 in her 401k, while my Roth IRA held around $870,000. I knew she'd likely try to claim a portion of my account. According to my lawyer, given the length of our marriage, a substantial portion of my retirement savings could be allocated to her under our state's laws. However, she was unaware of the actual amount in my Roth account. She had always been disengaged when it came to financial planning. I had to persuade her to open her 401k 9 years ago, and even then, her contributions were minimal. Most of her savings were employer matches, essentially free money she hadn't fully utilized. This stark difference reflected our roles throughout our marriage. I was the planner, the provider, the one who worked tirelessly for the life we had. She, on the other hand, was content to spend, often complaining that I worked too much or didn't take enough time off. In reality, my hard work was part of a shared dream: to retire early, move to South America, and enjoy the rest of our lives together. But now, it seemed she had checked out of the marriage early, choosing instead to indulge in an affair. What stung the most was the idea that she might take half of everything I had worked so hard to build. My lawyer had warned that retirement accounts are typically divided equally in long-term marriages. It felt deeply unfair. I had remained loyal, providing for my family and doing everything to ensure her happiness. Yet here I was, facing betrayal. Based on the recordings, I didn't think she planned to leave me for Craig. She seemed to enjoy the thrill of the affair, the excitement of something forbidden. In one of their conversations, he had tried to convince her to leave me, despite having a girlfriend and 3 young children of his own. She laughed at his suggestion, clearly not taking it seriously. She wasn't willing to give up the stability of our life for an unpredictable dealer, but she reveled in the attention he gave her. Listening to their conversations was emotionally grueling. She had referred to me as boring and unadventurous, criticized my performance in bed, and even called me a 5-minute man. While I knew this wasn't true, it was clear she said these things to stroke his ego. At 32, he was younger than I had initially assumed, given the baseball group was mostly people in their 40s. His compliments fed her fragile self-esteem, making her feel desired in a way she hadn't in years. Using his license plate, I found his address and began conducting occasional surveillance. I drove past his house a few times and noted that he lived with his girlfriend and 3 young children, all under the age of 10. The sight of his family only fueled my anger, knowing he was disrupting mine while maintaining his own. One evening, as we lay in bed, my wife did something unexpected. She initiated intimacy. I couldn't remember the last time that had happened, but I looked her in the eye and told her I was too exhausted to accept her invitation for intimacy. She became upset, pointing out that we hadn't been close in weeks. But I couldn't bring myself to be vulnerable with her, knowing what she had been doing behind my back. I offered a weak excuse about my demanding work schedule. The truth was that while I still found her physically attractive, I couldn't ignore the emotional damage. To me, she felt tainted, like someone who had lost all sense of loyalty and respect. Giving in would have felt like validating her betrayal. 2 days later, while at work, I received a notification from the Ring doorbell. I immediately checked the feed. It was him again, and my wife had let him in. My heart pounded. This time, I was only 15 minutes away. I jumped into my car and drove home, covering the distance in less than 10 minutes. This time, I avoided parking in the driveway, opting for the street to avoid alerting them. I always carried my Hellcat handgun in my car, though I hadn't anticipated ever needing it. As I approached the house, I steeled myself. I had spent countless hours imagining this moment, preparing myself emotionally. My goal wasn't to harm anyone, but I was ready to defend myself if necessary, especially considering his potential involvement in dealing. I decided to approach through the backyard, suspecting it might be his escape route again. By now, about 20 minutes had passed since the notification. I slid open the latch on the backyard gate as quietly as possible and entered. The kitchen door was wide open, as was the backyard door, confirming they were careless in their secrecy. From my vantage point in the kitchen, I could see into the living room. There they were, completely exposed, engaged in an intimate act on the couch. The scene sent a surge of rage through me. I dropped my keys onto the floor to free my hands and raised my Hellcat, commanding both of them to get down on the floor immediately. The sound of my voice startled them. Craig, partially dressed, scrambled to comply, trying to pull on his pants before I ordered him to stop. My wife grabbed a robe and began stammering apologies, saying, "It's not what it looks like." I ignored her, keeping my focus on Craig while ensuring my left pocket camera was still recording. My adrenaline was surging, but I knew I needed to remain in control. I ordered her to join him on the floor. My tone left no room for negotiation, and she quickly obeyed. Reviewing the footage later, I realized how high my adrenaline had been, as many details were a blur in the moment. Still, I knew I had to establish control before taking the next step. Craig begged for mercy, while my wife pleaded, insisting he meant nothing to her. I took out my phone and called 911, informing the dispatcher that there was a man in my house, involved with my wife, and likely carrying marijuana. I mentioned that I had him at gunpoint, but assured them I wasn't taking action, waiting for their arrival. After ending the call, I instructed Craig to stretch his hands forward and lie completely still. I warned him not to give me a reason to act. My wife remained on the floor, crying and apologizing, but I wasn't interested in hearing excuses. I walked to the front door and swung it wide open to ensure the police had easy access when they arrived. On the living room table, I noticed a small bag of marijuana. It wasn't much, but I hoped it would be enough to get him arrested. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity as I held them there. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I decided to FaceTime my daughter. My wife begged me not to involve her, but I ignored her protests. When my daughter answered, I explained the situation, showing her the scene. She broke into tears, unable to process what she was seeing. My wife lowered her head in shame, clearly mortified by the moment. I felt no sympathy. As my daughter spoke, I heard the sound of police cars pulling into the driveway. The officers entered the house cautiously. I raised my hands and lowered my Hellcat, ready to let them take over. I met the officers at the door and quickly explained the situation. Initially, there were only 2 officers, but within minutes, 2 more arrived, bringing the total to 4 officers and 2 patrol cars. The first officers detained Craig for the marijuana found in the living room. What followed was almost comical. They began blaming each other for the drugs. Craig claimed it belonged to my wife, while she adamantly insisted it was his. Watching them incriminate each other was surreal. Eventually, Craig admitted he had sold it to her, effectively taking responsibility. In hindsight, I realized I could have told the police it was my wife's, and as you'll see later, this might have been a better course of action. Since neither party would take full ownership, the officers detained both of them. By this point, 3 patrol cars were parked in front of my house, drawing the attention of neighbors. My wife, still in her robe, was allowed to dress before being placed in one of the cars. It was an embarrassing moment, having her partially exposed in front of several male officers, but I reminded myself that she had brought this situation on herself. When the marijuana was weighed, it totaled about 4 ounces, enough to potentially qualify as a state jail felony. However, one of the officers confided in me that the judge might reduce the charge to a Class A misdemeanor if it was deemed to belong solely to my wife. I wanted the police to focus their efforts on Craig. They escorted him to his car to search for additional contraband. At first, he refused, stating they needed a warrant. The officer countered that his earlier admission of giving marijuana to my wife provided probable cause. Soon after, more officers arrived, including a K-9 unit. The scene outside my house looked like a major bust was underway. It became clear they were determined to secure a significant charge against Craig, likely due to his criminal history. The search revealed approximately 4 pounds of marijuana in his car, enough for a state jail felony. This offense carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 180 days in prison, a maximum of 2 years, and a fine of up to $10,000. With his prior record, it seemed likely he would face the maximum penalty. It struck me how much trouble he had gotten himself into over an affair with someone else's wife. He had picked the wrong husband to cross. The officers later confirmed that Craig would be charged with the marijuana found in my house. My wife, however, was released without charges. Craig was arrested and taken into custody, and one of his associates came later to retrieve his car. I also asked the police to charge him with trespassing, but they explained that since he had been invited by my wife, no trespassing charge could be filed. They informed me I might need to visit the station to provide additional statements, even though I had already given a detailed account. Once my wife was released, she rushed into the bedroom and locked the door. Shortly after, my daughter called. She revealed that my wife had been trying to reach her, but she had refused to answer. My daughter asked what had happened, and I shared the entire story. She broke down in tears, unable to comprehend what her mother had done. While I felt bad for having exposed my wife's actions so publicly, I reminded myself that the blame wasn't mine. She had made the decisions that brought us here. My daughter asked about the next steps, and I explained that I had already contacted a real estate agent and planned to sell the house. I also told her that the divorce papers were prepared and would soon be served to her mother. She said she would visit us next week, though I knew it would be difficult for her. She had always been close to her mom. After our conversation, I sat in the quiet of the house, reflecting on the day's events. I felt a mix of emotions: sadness, anger, and disbelief. Our 22 years of marriage had unraveled, and there was no hero in this story. My wife stayed locked in the bedroom that evening, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The life we had built together felt irreparably broken. This wasn't how I envisioned our relationship ending. Just 2 years ago, my wife and I had traveled through South America, visiting Uruguay, Chile, and Peru, exploring places to buy a retirement home. Now, in the span of a single year, she had thrown everything away. I couldn't help but wonder why. Her recklessness in bringing him into our home was a shocking revelation. While I was relieved it exposed the truth, I couldn't shake the thought that this might not have been her only affair. How long had she been living this double life? That evening, I went to a local bar to meet a friend for drinks. We talked about everything except my wife and the earlier events. I needed to distract myself, even if only for a short while. While we were chatting, my eldest son called. He'd heard about the situation from his sister and apologized for his mother's actions. He told me he supported whatever decision I made and understood how difficult this was for all of us. His maturity made me proud. He had grown into a thoughtful man, now living with his serious girlfriend. I used to be the one giving him advice about relationships, but now I felt like I could use his guidance. When I returned home that night, I couldn't bring myself to face my wife. I chose to sleep in another room. The following day at work, I had a conversation with my youngest son, who had also learned about what had happened. My friend and boss offered his support and said he'd understand if I needed time off to handle the divorce. I left work early to visit my lawyer's office and collected the finalized divorce agreement for my wife to sign. I also contacted the real estate agent to list the house on the market. She planned to come by over the weekend to take photos for the listing. When I arrived home, my wife was waiting for me. She said she was ready to talk. I told her I wouldn't entertain a conversation until she signed the divorce papers. She insisted on speaking first, promising to sign afterward, but hinted that if I didn't let her talk, she might drag out the divorce process. I reminded her that she wasn't in a position to make threats. If she wanted a messy public divorce, I was fully prepared to take it as far as necessary. That seemed to calm her down. She asked for the papers and requested an explanation of the terms before signing. I explained that the house would be sold, with the proceeds split 60/40 in her favor. She would also receive the $4,000 in our joint account. In return, she agreed to an amicable divorce and would not claim any portion of my retirement savings. She found the arrangement fair, and I agreed. After she signed the papers, she asked to explain how the affair started and the details of her involvement. To her surprise, I told her I already knew everything. I revealed that I had been monitoring her conversations and actions through cameras and voice recorders, even pointing out where she had hidden her marijuana. She was stunned into silence. I made it clear I wasn't interested in hearing excuses. Her tears seemed more like an attempt to earn sympathy, but I remained resolute. What was done was done. It has been 2 weeks since I served my wife with the divorce papers. There are 76 days left before the divorce is finalized. The house hasn't sold yet, but there are 2 serious offers from potential buyers. For now, my soon-to-be ex-wife and I continue living in the same house, though we sleep in separate bedrooms. My daughter has cut off contact with her mother entirely. I'm trying to mediate, hoping they can rebuild their relationship. My sons still speak with their mother, but have clearly lost respect for her. I've come to terms with the fact that our family will never be the same. As for her affair partner, I've heard he was released on bail but is still awaiting trial. His case remains pending, and with the evidence against him, I believe he may receive a prison sentence exceeding 2 years. Hopefully, he'll face the consequences of his actions. This isn't how I imagined my life would turn out, but I'm determined to move forward and rebuild, even if it's without the family I once knew.